So this is a talk about the West and how reactionaries view decline. What is declining? So there are different attitudes to decline in reactionary circles, whether it's a decline in Christianity or Judeo-Christian values, whether it's a decline of European empires and European civilization, whether it's a racial decline or a decline in whiteness. But the question that I want to ask here is a Western decline caused by some prior decline, or is that prior decline itself Western decline? So what a lot of Christian reactionaries like to say as a meme is retake Constantinople. Now, is the fall of Constantinople, is it a decline, or is it actually the beginning of European, quote, Western civilization? Now, to understand the historical context of this event, it's worth going back in history. So this fall of Constantinople was the beginning of the Ottoman expansion into the Middle East and into Arabia, to the gates of Vienna, as reactionaries like to say. Now, why is this Ottoman expansion so significant? The Silk Road, which was a trade route that stretched from China to Europe, was important economically even in ancient times. It was a trade route that allowed silks and spices to be moved from China into the Roman Empire and the subsequent Eastern Roman Empire or the Byzantine Empire. Marco Polo would go along the Silk Road and write, whether or not you believe in all the conspiracy theories about him and the uncharted plotline or something else, but the Silk Road was very significant economically, and it contributed to the rise of Baghdad as a city which was the heart, or the jewel, if you like, of the, you could call it the Arabian or Muslim Empire. Cordoba in Spain, around the time of its golden age, was seen by the Holy Roman Empire as the ornament of Western Europe. And a lot of the success and the wealth of the quote-unquote Arab Golden Age, which reactionaries find to be a thorn in the side of their worldview, was in fact caused by the access to the Silk Road in that period of time. Now, when the Mongols would eventually sack Baghdad, the Muslim Empire would collapse. So the point is that a lot of the greatness of these civilizations is based upon the access to the Silk Road. So in the high medieval period, certain medieval Italian city-states would extend the Silk Road into Western Europe. And this would transform Western Europe from being essentially a backwater into being a viable contender to these Eastern or Arab states. So one of the reasons that this could occur in the first place is because of the commercial revolution. Now, the commercial revolution was a transformation in the relationship between the peasants and the feudal lords in Western Europe. The feudal lords demanded liquidity, partly because the access to the Silk Road meant that there were greater luxury commodities coming into Western Europe. And it wasn't possible to purchase these commodities with grain or with land. So they didn't desire or demand these in-kind contributions from their feudal serfs, and so they demanded liquidity. One of the ways that they achieved this was to transform the relation between the peasant and the lord into a moneyed one, where in fact the serfs would pay a rent to the lord, as opposed to contributing a certain amount of their agricultural produce. Another development of this was the enclosure movement and the wool trade in England specifically, where common land was enclosed by feudal lords. And these renting tenants, if you like, these tenants of the land, would be evicted in order for the land to be used as grazing land for sheep, because it was more profitable for these landlords and aristocrats to use their land for wool and sheep than it was for agricultural produce. So why did these merchant republics rise in the first place? And how did this explosion of wealth and development in Western Europe occur? The first, after the commercial revolution, which is perhaps one of the more foundational points, the adoption of Hindu-Arabic numerals by Fibonacci, and eventually most of the merchant class in Italy in the 13th century, was extremely important. This led to a more developed and nuanced form of double entry bookkeeping, in which the accounts of a merchant company could be more efficiently understood, and you would have these enormous books full of the accounts of, say, the Medici family, which would stretch for many hundreds of pages. Fibonacci himself was a student of accounting. Now, one of the consequences of this introduction of accounting is that whereas in the past, in say the 12th century, it would be necessary for merchants to literally and physically transfer gold and commodities across the land or the sea, it was no longer necessary for these commodities to actually be transported from, say, Anatolia into Italy. In fact, this decreased the level of risk that was involved in trade, and it did incentivize merchants to establish themselves, because whereas in the past, say in an ancient setting, the destruction of a fleet carrying gold could cause some kind of deflationary depression or something in the economy. In fact, now the risk of losing gold or going out of business reduced, because while the Knights Templar, for instance, had during the Crusades developed a kind of proto-American Express in which you could deposit a certain amount of money with the Templars in Europe and then use banknotes or IOUs to purchase along the way to the Holy Land, and then deduct that from your initial amount of money at the beginning, and so on. Double entry bookkeeping would become so advanced that you wouldn't, on a general scale of trade, even need to transport commodities, that you could apply that credit system that the religious orders developed into a generalized system where trade was not necessarily didn't have to necessarily be conducted physically, that all that was needed was a note being transferred from one of these merchant colonies in, say, Constantinople, which is the picture there, or in Baghdad or Alexandria or wherever, back to the HQ in Venice or Genoa to say that this trade has occurred and we can deduct a certain amount of money. You have your accounts receivable and payables and so on. So now that the Europeans could access the Silk Road through these new merchant classes, they could have a more efficient and more generalized access to it. A development also which was significant is the magnetic compass, which wasn't actually invented in Europe but introduced to Europe in the 14th century, and this just increased the efficiency of these Mediterranean trade routes. So now we understand the significance of the trade routes and the Silk Road and the intermediary effect that the merchant republics had between connecting the Silk Road to Western European powers and nations, what were the real consequences of the Ottoman sacking of Constantinople and the expansion of the Ottoman Empire? Well, what it meant was that these merchant republics that had once had ghettos or quarters that could use this double entry bookkeeping system in order to facilitate trade between the Silk Road and Western European countries. The Ottomans denied this access to the Western European countries. And so after the sacking of Constantinople and the subsequent expansion of the Ottoman Empire, merchants in the West and the feudal lords in the West were seeking a new trade route into the East. So Columbus left Spain in 1492. John Cabot left Bristol in 1497, both attempting to connect the West back with the East and connect to the wealth that was being funneled through the Silk Road through a new means, since that prior means that Venice and Genoa had once provided had been blocked by the Ottoman Empire. But they didn't find a new trade route initially. They found a new world. And this new world order of European colonialism began. So Spain and Portugal would cut up North and South America, essentially, as their own colonial states. So rather than finding a substitute for the trade route of the Silk Road, they actually found a new market. And the capital from the West that would have been invested in these trade routes into the East were instead invested in plantations and so on in North America. Great Britain had control of Jamaica, and the sugar plantations there were so profitable all the way up into the 18th century that in fact when the North American colonies declared independence, it was not seen as an immediate economic threat to the United Kingdom or the Great British Empire, because Jamaica was far more profitable with its plantations than North America. So instead of finding a substitute trade route, in fact, the Ottoman expansion and the decline of the Eastern Roman Empire led to the rise of Western European powers in this new global world order. The Dutch East India Company would eventually find a new trade route and solidify its dominance of that trade route around the Cape. And the British East India Company is more known than the Dutch East India Company, but it was the Dutch that initially began this. Now, one of the reasons that this happened was because the Dutch had a more advanced central banking system than the British. Because the issuances of bonds was very significant for the investment in these financial global trading companies. And part of the Glorious Revolution that occurred in the latter half of the 17th century in England was something of a corporate merger, I've heard it described, where in fact the technology of the Dutch banking system was fertilized into the English system. And it's no surprise that the Bank of England was founded immediately after the Glorious Revolution. So it meant that the state could back these financial enterprises in a more efficient way. And what all of this led to, inevitably, was the greatness of European colonialism. And so we go from the decline or the collapse of Christendom, if you will, or the Eastern Roman Empire, or the sack of Constantinople by the vicious Muslims and so on, into in fact being the inception of modern European power. That if this had not occurred, it's arguable as to whether the expansion and the dominance of Western European powers would have happened at all. So there's an ambiguity here as to how we understand decline and how reactionaries understand it, because this event in history could be viewed as either a decline or as the beginning of a rise, depending from which perspective you view it from. And this is ultimately the problem with reactionary views on decline of the West. Because when does this decline begin? Does it begin with the sack of Constantinople? Does it begin with the Reformation? Does it begin with the French Revolution or the democratic revolutions of the 19th century? Does it begin with the First World War, or does it begin with the revolution in France from the students, or the 60s liberation movement? And this is ultimately how you can understand how reactionary somebody is, because it's a general trend that the more right-wing somebody is, the further back in time they assume the inception of the decline of the West began. Somebody like Peter Hitchens, or a reactionary moderate, would argue that it began with either the sexual liberation of the 60s or with the collapse of the British Empire after the First World War. But as the sack of Constantinople led to an even greater rise in Western European power, so too in many ways did the decline of European powers lead to a greater increase in influence of the United States. The real story of the end of the First World War is how Wilson and the American establishment asserted their global hegemony, which would then come to define the 20th century up until the present day. So how we understand the decline, the inception of the decline and what is declining, is something that has no consensus in the right. In fact, it defines the right. So something that's often spoken about is the decline of Christianity, that the decline of the West is a decline in the church. But if the decline of the West is the decline of Christianity, then pre-Christian civilization wasn't Western civilization. Now, there are some ways of weaseling around this. Someone like Belloc or even the early church would argue that classical civilization was pregnant with Christianity. Somebody like Toynbee would argue that Western civilization was a synthesis of Christianity and ancient paganism. But reactionaries can kind of wiggle around this by saying that a classical civilization contained an aspect of Christianity. It was an incomplete form. But if it's not entirely Western, then post-Christian civilization can be in some extent civilized or great, because it stands to reason that these pre-Christian civilizations, the Romans and the Greeks and the Egyptians and Mesopotamians and so on, were not entirely Christian and so not entirely Western. But what do we mean by a spiritual decline? Is it a decline in the purity of the religion? That is, did the Reformation lead to some kind of progressive outburst? Well, the problem with that view is that the liberal Catholics were, if you like, during the Renaissance, were the anticipation of liberalism, Erasmus, Montaigne, etc. That liberal humanists in the Catholic world were in fact attempting in the Counter-Reformation to defend the liberal status quo against this quite extreme form of Protestant reformism. Is it a decline in morality? But this again becomes a problem, because while capitalism destroys the social relations between, say, man and God and man and woman, what is this morality as we understand it? Is it simply a Christian morality? Compassion can be understood as the defining Christian virtue. That ancient Greek and Roman civilization is quite cold and hard to us today because there's no element of kindness or compassion to the vanquished is no mercy given, and the Greek city-states would enslave each other. The heroic in the Iliad, for instance, is never understood on its own terms by modern Westerners. That we would see Hector as the hero as opposed to Achilles, whereas in the Greek mind, the reverse would be the case. Why is that? Because we view someone like Achilles as being too harsh and too cruel and too violent. He lacks compassion, he lacks a humanity, whereas Hector, defending his family, who is generally portrayed in modern eyes as being somebody not weak, but as somebody who is strong in his resolution to defend against all odds, we actually view somebody who was not necessarily the hero as being the hero. And that can be understood as being caused by the compassion within Christianity.
So if compassion is the defining virtue of Christianity, it becomes very difficult to use compassion in Christianity to defend reactionary politics.
Now, whether this compassion is something that is a concealed vanity or a concealed resentment, which is a sort of Nietzschean point, is really not relevant in this. The extent to which compassion is not compassion is not really the subject of this. We understand that the West, the Christian West, was more compassionate than the Greek world, at least as it viewed itself, not necessarily in its acts. So the problem is that Christian reactionaries will conflate the West with Christianity. And this kind of conflation is ironic because a lot of the concepts of, say, whiteness or the West or of Europe emerged as a consequence of the sack of Constantinople and the subsequent colonialism. That whiteness emerged as a way to differentiate Europeans from the conquered colonial subjects. So ultimately the problem is, with these reactionaries, is that it's an equivocation. That the decline of the West is viewed as a decline of Christianity, or a decline of a particular ideology, or of a particular spiritual assumption of, say, to Evola, it was a decline of feudal society. To Thomas Carlyle, it was the decline of a sort of native oligarchy in England. To somebody like Peter Hitchens, it was the decline of economic and political imperialism of the British Empire. So the West is never defined by anything other than decline. The reason that it's so difficult to understand the West, and a lot of YouTubers and people have written about the problems with understanding a definition of the West, have fallen short in the fact that it's all well and good to understand that the West is ultimately meaningless, but it has a meaning to people that defend it. But what that meaning is entirely defined by decline. The West is declining, and it always is, and it always has been, and it always will, because the West is defined by that aspect of society, that religious particularity that is at a certain sense in decline. It could be a political or economic decline. It could be a particular religious decline, whether Protestant or Catholic. It could be a moral decline which itself emerged or grew from capitalism. Or, as I say, to go back to imperialism and economic decline, it could be a decline that itself emerged from some other decline. So the point is that the West is always in decline. And this is why we will have reactionaries with us forever. Because in the reactionary mind, everything is declining and nothing is declining. There's a contradiction within the whole band of the right, in which simultaneously the West is declining in one sense, but rising in another sense. Jonathan Bowden, the far-right orator, would speak of an empty technological colossus. And this is the way that many that consider the West to be in a spiritual decline view the West, as in so many ways triumphant, but in so many ways collapsing. Whether it's attitudes to, if you're a kind of moderate conservative, attitudes towards the Cold War, in that capitalism has been everywhere triumphant, and yet at the same time, people are liberal and therefore communism has won and the West is in decline. So that even a victory for the West can be portrayed as a decline, because the essence of the point is that the West to these people is defined by decline. And so to go back to the point of what is declining, how do reactionaries view decline, we have to understand that it's a deeper point than just some external cause that can be resolved. The West is decline.